So hi everybody, my name is Oscar Hernandez with Houston in Action. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are happy to have a lot of people coming into our arts and digital organizing training, and really glad to be working with Andrea Assaf and some of our amazing presenters that you will hopefully get to connect with them for a lot further than just today, but definitely learn a lot from what we're going to be working on. So as we start off for today, the first thing I wanted to cover is if we could please have a small round of introductions. And as we do the introductions, one of the things we want to recognize is the native land that we are in. So if you want to share your name, pronouns, and where you're zooming from, if you're not sure what native land you are in, feel free to go to the website we have here at the bottom, which is native-land.ca, and you'll be able to figure out where you're, what's the native land that you're zooming in from. Here in Houston, the native lands that we're on is on the Carrizo, Come Crudo, the Carawaka, the Atacapa, and the Sana people. I always butcher the pronunciations of these, but if you know how to say it better than me, please don't hesitate to correct me. As we're also logging in, please share your names, your pronouns, where you're zooming in from. But we want to ground ourselves in a specific check-in question, which is, what is your relationship to digital space right now? And what are the platforms you're using to create or organize? So anything you can think about as you are artists and organizers in this space, what platforms do you use, and what does that digital space look like? We know that a lot of folks have been shifted into a lot more digital work as we keep progressing and moving forward through this pandemic. But we know there's a lot of creative platforms that maybe a lot of other people might not have heard about. So by sharing in the chat, we would love to hear and connect other people to those resources and those ideas. So I see other people are joining in and sharing some information. Thank you so much for participating in the chat, as we will be using the chat a lot for this conversation. So for Houston in Action, we are a organization comprised of 50 plus different nonprofit groups. Our role as Houston in Action is to, we want to help fight the systemic barriers that our communities come up against. And these systemic barriers have been historically pushed against our communities. And our intention with every meeting is also to start off not just with a reminder of who we are, but through our working principles. And I'm not going to read all the working principles, but feel free to do so if you can. For today's training, or one of the working principles that I want to ground ourselves on is engagement with the community. And what we mean by engaging with the community is engaging in ongoing dialogue with the communities that the initiative serves in order to inform continuous improvement and accountability. Now, for us, when we mean who do we serve, it's not just HI staff, it's also all the different nonprofits that we work with, including the amazing artists that we're currently working with. Big shout out to all the H-Town Power folks, and big shout out to all the H-Town votes and all the artists who are coming in. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on to Andrea Assaf.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrea Assaf and I'm zooming in from Tampa, Florida, which is Seminole land. I'm the artistic director of Art2Action, and I use she or they pronouns are fabulous. And I'm really excited to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat. I see a whole bunch of folks from Houston, a whole bunch of folks from Tampa, Florida, and possibly from around the US. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to do just a brief introduction to community agreements. We are going to be receiving some wonderful presentations and lots of awesome information today. And we hope to have a good amount of time for a Q&A at the end of this session. So for that reason, we like to just check in with the values that guide some of our open conversation and dialogue. You can go to the next slide. So here are a few community agreements that Houston in Action likes to use, including keeping a long-term focus. And in this work, in this organizing work, we value progress over politeness. We're trying to actually move the conversation forward, but we do want to be polite. We want to make space for everyone to speak. So in the Q&A, please kind of self-monitor how much you're participating and make sure that we have time to include multiple voices. And we ask that you don't make assumptions, but ask a question when you have one. And we'll try to focus on the issue, not the person. If disagreement or even just multiple truths come up, and practice the ability to hold multiple truths and understand, listen for understanding another's perspective and how their community is impacted. If you have other community agreements that you like to use, please feel free to add them in the chat. I'm going to introduce our, and actually, could we maybe go out of the slides for just a second while I introduce folks? I get to introduce our very exciting and awesome speakers, and it's great to see you all, those who are in the Zoom room with us. And we talked about doing introductions by way of how we know each other, a kind of relational introduction. So first, let me say that this session on art and digital organizing that you've zoomed into or tuning into is part of a series that we're doing in partnership with Houston in Action and Art2Action. So we've been doing a number of trainings on different topics, including cultural organizing, artists and voting, racial justice, and healing justice. And those trainings and offerings will continue. Some of them have been recorded, and we can share those recordings with you if you're interested. And we also invite you to continue on this journey with us in this series. But today I get the great pleasure of introducing you to Irna Landrum. And Irna is a previous board member of Art2Action who served multiple terms and has been a fabulous supporter of Art2Action. And in fact, how we know each other is that several years ago, I was creating a show commissioned by Pangea World Theater in Minneapolis, where Irna currently lives. And this person that I had never met was just blasting my show all over social media and saying, "I'm so excited about this work. I can't wait to see it." And I said, I think I need to know who this person is, who is connecting and supporting the work through digital means. And so through a mutual friend, I contacted Irna and said, we should have lunch. And in that lunch, I said, I think you need to be on my board. And after a few more conversations, Irna finally said yes, and has been a part of Art2Action ever since. And after stepping down as a board member, is currently a collective member as a writer and an artist herself, and has a whole other life in digital organizing work, which you will hear about. I'm going to drop Irna's bio in the chat, but that's my relational introduction. And I'm going to turn it over to Irna to tell us about our other guest speaker as well.
Thank you so much, Asaf, which is how I know Andrea. I know Iram Ali because we met as members of the inaugural cohort of the Kairos Fellowship for Digital Organizers and Leaders of Color. Excuse me. We shared a bunch of weird inside jokes, among them calling each other Pushins. I know Iram as someone with a fierce side eye and a healthy skepticism, but also just one of the most brilliant strategic thinkers and campaigners that I've ever gotten to know. My supervisor and I have often talked about trying to poach Iram because she's so thoughtful and brilliant and has a great analysis that also includes just like her Muslim identity, but also an international perspective on all of the work that we're doing. And I also know Iram as being one of the people that you look at in a room to gauge how the group is doing.
That is awesome. We're going to go to Iram in just a second, and I realized that I did not give you an overview of the agenda. So we're going to go back to the slide deck and look at the agenda for the session, and then we'll pass it to Iram. So we've done welcome and introductions and talked about working principles and agreements and are introducing our guest speakers. This is an abbreviated list of some of the topics they're going to touch on, but an overview of what is digital organizing, the notion of punctuated moments, social media, and then what happens in the work of digital organizing, partnerships and collaborations, and then we hope to have some time for all of you to engage in Q&A. We encourage you, if you have questions as we're going along, to put the questions in the chat, and we'll try to keep track of them and address them at the end of the session. And also we may have some time to actually talk at the end of the session. So with that, I think we're ready to turn it over to our first section with Iram Ali. And thank you so much for joining us, Iram.
Thank you, Andrea and Irna, for that introduction. I'm really, really glad to be here and to have this conversation with everyone. So in the chat, I would love for people to tell us, like, what do you love about the internet and what do you hate? And I'll wait a little bit for people to get their thoughts together, because we are talking about digital organizing, which is living on the internet, basically.
I feel like we should have some game show music.
Right. Who's gonna go first? In the chat. Love creative spaces. The decentralized nature. Hate data and surveillance, same. Accessibility to people, especially the way that it has impacted us during coronavirus, right? Like, I can't imagine not having the internet as a way to connect right now. Connectivity to larger communities, and hate that it's time consuming, right? Like, you can just keep scrolling and that never ends. And it can really, really eat up your time. The speed at which you can find ideas and perspectives. Hate how anonymity emboldens the worst in people. That's all really, really real. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you all for sharing all of that. And at Kairos, what we like to think of digital is, like, digital is a realm, right? And so is the internet. It's not just a tool that we're using to connect to people. Actually, what it is a place, like, it's an arena of power. And when we think about how our opposition, whoever that may be for your organizations, whether they're campaigning against your campaign issue or what have you, uses digital, they use it very, very well, right? And what our goal is to get really good at seeing digital as an arena of power, where we are actively building power and building leaders within that arena. So if we go to the next slide, there are 3 real questions that I would love for people to think about. And you can, take notes on the side, but really think about, who are your people? If you're coming from an organization, that might be like, who are the people that I'm trying to organize? And you can get as granular as you want, right? I'm trying to organize Vietnamese American youth in Austin, for example, right? As, like, get as granular as you want. And when you find your people and who you're actually trying to organize, or if you're an artist, it's like, who am I trying to reach with my art? And who am I trying to move with my art, right? Long term, like, what are you trying to move your people towards? Is it a certain political analysis? Is it, you want them to take action towards prison abolition, right? Like, what is your long-term goal? What are you trying to move them towards? And then short-term, between now and November 3rd, if everyone is focused on the upcoming election, what are you trying to accomplish and how does it fit into your long-term goal? So if we use that example that I gave of my people being hypothetically Vietnamese Americans that I'm trying to organize in Austin, who are youth, and I'm trying to move them on a particular issue, for November 3rd, my goal might be I want to organize Vietnamese youth in Austin to participate in the election so that we build a community that has a clear goal. And then after November 3rd, we continue on with like our issue campaigning work. So we figured out who our people are, what we're trying to move them towards, and then what our short-term goal is related to the election. If we go to the next slide. Then we're trying to figure out, well, where can we reach them, right? And when we think of digital, there's a whole lot of places where you can reach people. But you need to know that not all of these platforms are the same. And sometimes that's obvious, right? Like Facebook is not the same as us having this conversation on Zoom. But then like knowing the differences in terms of how those platforms are built can be really, really important, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all of those platforms are mediated by algorithms. That means that just because people follow you, it doesn't mean that they're going to see your content on a daily basis, right? They might see it once in a while, they might see it never, but it impacts the way you can reach people. Then there are gathering spaces like Zoom, Google Hangouts, even like getting on a phone conferencing call. And they might have capacity limits. So you just need to like work through what you need from that space. And then for organizations in particular, although it also works for artists, is like, how are you reaching people directly? Is it through email? Is it through SMS? Or is it through like Slack and peer-to-peer texting, right? There are a lot of organizations that do end up creating Slack rooms or Slack channels where they invite their volunteers, for example, or some member leaders to participate in the decision-making of an organization. And these are also tools and platforms that artists can use if they want to build community with other artists or people. If we go to the next slide, I do have an example of how this connected for me. So as Andrea mentioned in the chat, I worked on the Warren campaign during the primary this year, and this is for educational purposes only, right? We are nonprofits working in nonpartisan spaces, so this is not meant as an endorsement. So when I was working on the Warren campaign, I wanted to reach young voters of color, right? And I was like, how am I gonna do that? And then we had a rollout. If you remember, Elizabeth Warren had a lot of plans. And so one of the plans was around public education, right? Pre-K through 12 education. And I was like, how do I take this and make it into something that people will actually want to galvanize around, right? And we held a brainstorm, and one of the ideas that came out of it, and I worked very, very closely with our designers on this, was what if we made a sticker that kind of pinpointed towards people, people's identity as being from like a public school system, right? Could that trigger an identifier that gets them to be like, yes, that's me, and I want that thing, and I want to be on, the list, like Elizabeth Warren's list, and hear more about her plans. So I worked very closely with our design team and with, wordsmiths, and we finally landed on this sticker. And the reason why it was so important to bring everyone in at the beginning was because I would have never come up with this idea for a sticker alone. And our designer actually had to sell this idea, because when I first looked at it, I was like, what is this? And she was like, it's a school bus. And if you actually look it up, it looks exactly like a school bus, right? And I'm a New York City bred person, right? We don't have school buses. We see them once in a blue moon when we're going on school trips, right? So for me, it wasn't even in my vision that like, oh, this looks like a school bus. So she sold it to us, and then I was like, okay, you know what? Let's go with this. And we tested it out. And it did very, very well. So it brought in substantially more young people of color than any of our other stickers had, right? And the through line here, right, is after this was successful, another senior advisor reached out to me and they were like, okay, how do we do this for older voters, like senior voters? And I was like, no. Like, this was a really great, successful tactic. We got a lot of young voters of color who ordered this free sticker, especially off of Instagram. But we couldn't take this tactic and replicate it for older voters, right? Just because it worked for one audience and for one group of people does not mean the same thing is gonna work for another group of people. And that's really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about who your people are and what are the platforms on which you can reach them. If we can go to the next slide. And to that end, so you know who your people are, you know which platforms you're using to reach them. The next question is, what are you asking them to do, right? And it could be like, oh, I want them to watch this video, or I want them to look at my art piece. But then what's the next step? What comes after that? And then there's this idea called the ladder of engagement. This is very popular also in traditional organizing spaces. And it's the same, it's also applied similarly in digital organizing. So you start from a small ask, right? Like, get this free sticker is the example we just saw, but it could also be watch this video or sign this petition. Then what's the ask above that? Once someone has done that, what else could you ask them to do to move them along this ladder of engagement? Do you have time to chat with me? Can you share this with your friends and family? Even higher than that is can you volunteer to make phone calls to voters that we're trying to target? Even higher, become a leader within our organization, potentially, right? Or with the organization that I'm working with, they're looking for volunteers to lead hubs and organize people for the election. So what does that ladder of engagement look like for you? And one thing that I will say is, in the past 4 years, what we've seen is that it's not always linear, right? Somebody might purchase a sticker from you who doesn't even follow you, right, on social accounts. And so you would need to figure out, oh, where do I plug this person in? Maybe it's a conversation. How did you find out about me? And what made you purchase this thing? And hey, by the way, if you're really interested in this idea that I'm creating content around, maybe you would be interested in, spending some time with this organization that's working to get out volunteers, right? So it's not always linear is what I want everyone to remember from that. And so meet people where they're at, where they're coming in from, and have a clear idea of where you want to move them. So that was a little introduction on digital organizing and how things to think through. I'm gonna pass it now to Irna to dig into a little bit more about, and sorry about that, I live in New York City, so you will definitely hear traffic. But I'll pass it to Irna to speak a little bit about how to use important moments that come up within the digital space.
Thank you, Iram. So I just want to, talk about rapid response versus punctuated moments. Because as you're doing any work, any type of organizing work, or in any type of long-term artistic project, there are moments that happen that can cause you to need to pivot very quickly and make a choice. So Kairos, which is which is the organization that, you know, sort of raised Iram and I both as digital organizers, talks about rapid response versus punctuated moments, because without a strategy, you can find yourself pulled in a bunch of directions just because something has happened. And so we have to know that not every moment, not every rapid response moment, not every crisis is strategic for us to respond to, right? And so if I can get the next slide. A punctuated moment is when we strategically seize a crisis or make a timely intervention to advance our goal. Not every crisis or rapid response opportunity is a punctuated moment. Not every crisis or rapid response opportunity is strategic. And we have to develop the muscle to discern between the two, right? And so I'm going to give a couple of examples of punctuated moments, and also an example of seizing strategically on a crisis, as well as making a timely intervention, right? Can I get the next slide? So in order for us to start discerning between a rapid response moment and a punctuated moment, there's some criteria involved. If this is a strategic opportunity for our campaign to make an intervention, we'll know that because it aligns with our strategy and our timeline. It doesn't take us away from our goal. It doesn't cause us to chase something else that we don't have the time to chase. Does it align with our values? Does this make sense for the work that we're doing? Is it within our strategy? Is it within our mission? Is it within our values, right? I know a lot of nonprofits talk about mission creep and doing things because like a grant has popped up and maybe that doesn't make sense for your organization, or some crisis has happened and there's some money available to respond to that, but it doesn't necessarily actually align with their values. And another criteria for us to consider is, how does this impact our partners? How does this help us build our working relationship? How does this help us strengthen our collaboration? And how does it impact the work that we're able to do separately and together? And if it's something that can strengthen it, then that might be a strategic punctuated moment. Can I get the next slide? So this is the Christchurch Mosque in New Zealand, which in March of 2019, there's an awful massacre there where someone attacked the mosque and many people were wounded, many were killed, and it was just something that rippled out across the world. It was clearly a targeted attack on Muslims informed by white supremacy and Islamophobia. And in that moment, lots of organizations figured something that has happened that is rippling so big throughout the world means we have to respond to it. One of the responses, can you get the next slide? One of the responses from that was from the No Muslim Ban Ever, campaign. That campaign had actually already been working with legislators on the Hill to introduce an act called the No Ban Act. That act would not only repeal the Muslim ban, which had been, I don't even know which iteration we were on at the time that happened, but it would not only repeal the Muslim ban, but would actually limit the power of the executive to issue any type of executive order, issuing a blanket ban on nations. And of course, knowing that these nations have been targeted because they're majority Muslim. And so when the Christchurch massacre happened, my organization, which is Daily Kos, is a part of the No Muslim Ban Ever Coalition, Empower Change, which is a Muslim-led digital organization. We're already talking to legislators who are going to introduce this legislation. And part of the strategy that they'd already crafted was for the legislation to be introduced with huge support and lots of co-sponsors. And so when the Christchurch massacre happened, the No Muslim Ban Ever coalition put out a call to members through the coalition to sign a petition and then also contact their legislators to make sure that they were signed on as a co-sponsor of the No Ban Act, so that when the bill was introduced, it would have broad support and would already have momentum as soon as it hit the floor. One thing I wanted to point out was the art in particular. There's been, and just disclosure, I'm not a Muslim, but I know that there's been criticism among Muslim organizing about sort of the way that people think of Muslims generally being either Arab or Desi people, and often leaving out Black American Muslims, African Muslims, and people who, and Black folks. And so this art definitely was really intentional to reflect all of the different ways that Muslims look across the world. And really also, I am editorializing, but I think it was really also strategic that these people were women who were on the art. And so when we talk about a punctuated moment, there's something that came up, which was horrible. It was horrific, but people were paying attention to it. In my own organization, people were looking for ways to financially support Muslim organizing in a way that they had never done before. And the No Muslim Ban Ever campaign seized on that moment, seized upon that moment to get a lot more support for this bill that was coming up. Can I get the next slide? So an earlier slide talked about a punctuated moment as either strategically seizing on a crisis or making a timely intervention. And so I like to really be clear with people that you can actually make a punctuated moment, right? And so this is Rosa Parks being booked after her civil disobedience and refusing to give up her seat for a white man who had gotten on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. And we know this throughout history as the moment that sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. What fewer people know is that the Montgomery bus boycott had been in the works for a long time. Organizers were already organizing a boycott, not only because of segregation and Black people not being able to sit wherever they wanted to on the bus, but also because of just, it was dangerous. Sometimes people would have to get on and pay their fare and then go to the back of the bus, and bus drivers would leave them, or they'd start stepping on the bus and the bus would take off and they would get harmed. And specifically who was being really harmed by this were Black domestic workers who were also women. And so there had been this bus boycott in the works for a moment, and they were looking for a punctuated moment. And folks may or may not know that Rosa Parks is not the first person to engage in civil disobedience around bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. 9 months prior, there was a young woman by the name of Claudette Colvin who'd also refused to give up her seat and was dragged off the bus. And there are a few, so when the Southern Christian Leadership Council went to go and kind of vet Claudette to see if she could be the face of the boycott, they found a young woman who was unwed and pregnant, and because of the respectability politics of the era, thought that it would not be strategic to try and make her the face of the movement. And so almost an entire year later, Rosa Parks did the same civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action. And because of her reputation and standing in community, people said, this is the time we can go. There's no way that there's just nothing that people can attach to her. And so this boycott was going to happen at some point, but the punctuated moment was actually created, and they were waiting for it to happen. Actually, what's the next slide? Oh no, I don't need the next slide. We can pause.
Yeah, I feel like this is a good moment to pause and see, because that was a lot of information from digital organizing to punctuated moments, to see if there's any questions coming up or other, because I find often that people are confused about what punctuated moments are in comparison to rapid response, and how that actually interacts with each other when we're talking about digital strategy. I will say, you know, there's another example that comes to mind for me, and that was around the 2016 elections. People were really terrified that there would be a Muslim registry, right? And the response that we saw was, well, if there's a Muslim registry, I'll register as a Muslim too. And a lot of people made like graphics around that, and we're repeating that over and over and over again. And I was just sitting there like, oh my God, if there's a Muslim registry, you'll register as a Muslim too. How's that gonna help me? And also there's data, right? Like we live in the digital realm. Like there's so much data that's been collected. I'm pretty sure they can figure out who is and isn't Muslim in some ways, right? May not be perfect, but we've also given up enough data willingly to social platforms where they will know. And so we used the election essentially to galvanize around this issue. So immediately after the election, we were like, listen, this is a real threat, and we need to organize our communities around it. And so instead of letting people repeat that, the campaign that I and another grassroots organization, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving in New York, came up with was that actually there's an existing Muslim registry from the Bush era. It was a post 9/11 Muslim registry program where they made undocumented young Muslim men register. And that still existed in November 2016. And so we decided, although it wasn't being used, it was still on the books, it existed, and it could be used by future administrations. And so we decided, you know what, like we're gonna go after that registry and try to dismantle it instead of just creating this like messaging that wasn't actually going to change anything. And we did. That was like a successful campaign. It was dismantled, and the next administration could not actually bring it up again. So that's like another example of how to take the time to do your research and not to get caught up in a rapid response moment just because you feel like you need to jump on it, and actually use it as a punctuated moment to move your original long-term goals.
Right. That sort of reminds me of some of the social media campaigns that go viral really quickly, but they move really quickly away from the strategy. Do you remember this one where on Facebook and Instagram people were saying, it was a blackout day, and so we're gonna all black out our profile pictures, and that's gonna stand for that's going to be our protest against how Black people are silenced on social media. And I don't know who started it. They actually took somebody else's idea and got it wrong. It was this weird game of internet telephone, but it actually had the impact of people silencing themselves on purpose, right? Like the protest was against silencing, and suddenly, you know, like people all over the internet were refusing to engage on that day. And so it actually, besides, I see that there, Christina, besides being performative with no real action, it actually replicated what the protest was supposed to be against. And it wasn't strategic, it was rapid, it was responsive, and there was no strategy involved.
Yeah, I remember that. And on Instagram in particular, because they were using the Black Lives Matter hashtag, it actually buried all the content, right? So if you went to the hashtag, you just saw like black boxes, and it was like, okay, like you didn't actually see anything related to the issue. And that was really, really, like, yeah, it was bad. Okay, so maybe now we can, if there are no questions coming up, we can move to like social media. And then what, right? Like, so you post content on social media, but then what comes next?
Well, we have actually a question that came in. It says, can we get the definition of a punctuated moment again?
Yeah, Oscar, can you just really quickly run back to slide 15? And thank you for that question. Punctuated moment is when we strategically seize on a crisis or make a timely intervention to advance our goal. So it's a strategic response to a crisis moment, to a fever pitch moment. Iram has called them an inflection point, which is something that you can respond to either strategically or make the strategic decision not to respond to it because it doesn't align with the goals of your campaign. But you can strategically respond to that crisis moment and make a timely intervention that can advance your strategy. And so what Iram and I were just talking about was the difference between doing that in a way that can further your goal or doing it in a way that can be really unstrategic. Did that answer the question? Great. And then Iram, you're about to go into social media.
Yep, so social media and then what? Oftentimes what we see is like, we're just gonna post content on social media, right? And somehow that will just magically move people, right? So if we go to the next slide. But, and this might be basic for some people, right? But like for people who have limited experience in digital, what if we actually looked at each post as a way to have a conversation with all of your followers, with your members, with everyone, essentially, because it's a public platform in some ways. And then also beyond the conversation as a way to move people to action. So remember when we talked about the ladder of engagement, there are so many things that you can ask people to do who follow you and who engage with your content. And some of those ways are on the next slide, right? And it might be like possible that if you're an artist working closely with an organization, you know exactly where you need to point people to, especially in the lead up to the election, right? Is it making a pledge to vote? Is it donating money to the organization so they can continue contacting more voters? Is it reporting back? Is it sharing with a friend, right? Like, so let's say you have a video up that's more about persuasion, right? You're trying to persuade people to vote, or you're trying to provide them information for where they can go to vote. It might be that you just need to share, ask your viewers to share the video with a friend or on their own page. It might be about mail-in ballots, right? Like pushing people to actually get their mail-in ballots to drop-off locations, if there are drop-off locations where you're located, or to submit them to the USPS. And then like the third one is volunteer at polls. That has been like a huge need recently because people who tend to volunteer at polls tend to be older, and they are more susceptible to the coronavirus now. And so there was this huge need, and there is this huge need to have people volunteer at polls on election day, that I think young voters are actually stepping up and signing up to do that. But there's so many things, right, that you can point people to, and getting it down in terms of like, when should I be pointing people to what is really, really important. And like that collaboration between like organizations and what they need voters to do and artists becomes really important when it comes to content on social media. But speaking of, right, like you can share the right content, have the right ask, but then how do you measure everything? So going into the next slide. That's where we look for like online engagement, right? And there's a difference between quantity and quality. And then there's also this thing called like vanity metrics, right? When you post a video, for example, are you only looking at the total number of views? And if you are, what if like people have only seen the first 3 seconds of the video that you posted? Is that still significant for you, right? Or are you looking for how many people have watched the full video on Facebook, right? look at the comments. How many comments are there, but also how many are positive? How many are interacting with your content in a positive way, and how many are negative? And then there might also be trolls, right? Like, so not to get caught up in trolls, but if the members of your own community are engaging negatively with something you've posted, then that should throw up a red flag. And you should try to engage with why that's happening and what change is actually needed. Look at the responses to those comments, right? Are there people who actually consistently reply back to other people in your comments? And if they do, like, those are probably like people you might want to have a conversation with, because they're super engaged. Reactions to posts, also positive, negative. When it comes to emails, and this might be more for organizations, but there's a difference between looking at only the number of opens, right? Like, how many people open the email versus what percentage of people who received the email actually opened it, right? So if 100 people could open the email and you could be like, oh, that's great, but then only like 0.1% of the people who you sent it to opened it, well, like, you know, maybe you need to like do a little bit more testing. And how many people are answering the call to action? And this is, again, where collaboration comes in, because you might not know that on the front end, but if you're creating content to get out the vote, then what does it mean to know how many people actually voted because of the art that you created? And how do you set up the system to actually know that? That's where I'm gonna pause. And I know we're going into more collaboration with Irna. So I don't know if you wanna just jump right into it, or if you have more to add on this stuff.
I actually, if we go back to the previous slide, I won't spend a lot of time here, but I was thinking of before. I was thinking of with these asks, you know, like this is get out the vote season. I was just thinking about some punctuated moments that have happened in the cycle. Around these things, right? When we saw the primaries in Wisconsin, in Georgia, and just the long lines, the huge long lines of people, and there are all the concerns about coronavirus and the concerns about just voter suppression, like people shouldn't have to wait in line that long. That was definitely a punctuated moment at which people particularly started looking at having people be poll workers, so that there were more people to help process those ballots more quickly, so that the lines went more smoothly. And I was just thinking about that as an example. And I think when we get into the Q&A, I'd love to talk about more, but another example is Justice Ginsburg. When Justice Ginsburg died a few weeks ago, that was also a critical punctuated moment for people right now, because it just, everyone all across the political spectrum started moving about to figure out what would happen with that Supreme Court vote. And so that launched campaigns to either support or oppose the nominee. It launched campaigns, or it intensified campaigns to get out and vote. Like, this is why we have to get out and vote, because the Supreme Court is really important. And it's a moment that definitely complemented people's existing get out the vote strategy. And I just wanted to say that while it was on my mind, because I'm the kind of person who would forget otherwise. So if we go to the collaboration slide. So for some reason, my external mouse is being really finicky. So yeah, I just wanna, we're gonna talk about collaboration. What does it look like to be doing this work in collaboration with people across sectors and across disciplines? If we can go to the next slide. So in the chat, I'm curious, when you as an individual, as an artist, or as an organization are looking to do work together in collaboration or partnership, what do you look for? How do you know that this is going to be a fruitful collaboration? Respect and equality, win-win, Trust and clear communication absolutely are things that I look for. Mutual interests, aligned values, like-minded. So, right, like we know what it is that we want. There's a lot here about values, about commitment, about integrity. A lot of this is what's happening, about shared values, right? And I have worked both as an organizer and as an artist in collaboration across disciplines, across sectors. And so if we get the next slide. I don't know about you, but this has been my experience a lot of the time. And I feel like I'm just completely dating myself with this out of date meme. A lot of organizations, when they get this idea to do a collaboration with an artist, think about it really after the project is almost done. It's like, oh, we're almost done. We should get a poet or a muralist, and think that, and really the idea is that because the person or artist or organization was asked at all, that this is collaboration. I know that, gosh, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on it, but some of the ways that I've seen this happen have been an organization has already designed a development project. We have this building and it's going to be great and it's going to be so wonderful and lovely for the community. And what we'll do is there's a blank wall that's kind of facing downtown and it's ugly. We need a muralist now to decorate it. And like, we don't want, like when artists and organizers are collaborating, we don't want the art just to be decorating the work. And at the same time, I've also been in the, I'm going to not call out any particular organization because that's not professional, but an organization that sort of adopted a disinvested community that they were not from and decided to make art there, and felt like the low-income community should just be really grateful for the new beautiful things in their community that they'd not asked for and had no attachment to. And so then they ended up trying to do a community project about keeping the sculptures unvandalized, right? Because people did not have any connection to the art or to the community. And so, right, collaboration should have all of the things that you all have listed. But sometimes what's missing in collaboration is actual collaboration. I think people have been in group projects that are more like, I'm definitely going to do more work, but we're all going to get the credit for it. Or those sorts of group projects where everyone goes off into their corner and comes back together and tries to mash it all up and make it look like we worked on it the whole time. So I have, next slide, please. Just put up some questions for folks to consider, because I think my understanding is that people are at different levels of experience collaborating as organizers and artists. So some of the questions to consider in a collaboration so that you can get values aligned, mission aligned, figure out how to be honest with each other and equitable, and to build in clear communication, is start to ask some of these questions at the beginning of the project as it's being designed, right? Not as an afterthought. What is the impact that we want to make together? What is the impact that we want to make together? How will our work together achieve that? And what is the end result? Do we want some engagement to have happened as an end result? Do we want a project? And that's really important. Like, is the project itself the end result, or is it the engagement that's going to come from it? And that's, it could go either way, but that's the kind of thing that you want to hash out. What do we need to know going in or along the way? Who do we need to know to get close to or to be wary of? I worked as a neighborhood organization in this neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there's this little old lady named Miss Bertha Givens. She was not elected to anything. She was not on any board or any council, but if you really wanted to get something done, you needed to know Miss Bertha. And you needed her stamp of approval. It was very unofficial, and it was very just the way it is. So what do we need to know? What dynamics are up? Sometimes when I'm doing facilitation work and I'm starting to collaborate with an organization, I say, well, what's going on? What power dynamics are at play? Who's really excited about this? What resistance and hesitation is there? What are the dynamics that are up? And is our work sort of in spite of that? Is our work going to try and help shift that? What's going on? What is the work that we're going to take on together, that we should be at the table doing all-nighters together? And what's the work that we feel like you can do this and I can do that and we'll come back together? How do we share and split our duties and responsibilities? I think this one is really important. How will decisions be made? Who holds the final approval? How do we know that each of the partners has had enough input and influence over this before we move forward? What are our agreements about that? Are we going to have a consensus project, a consensus approval, majority approval, or is it just the fact that it has to come from on high, that person needs to approve it? How do decisions get made about this project, and how do we stay in communication, right? Like if we start talking today about a project where the end date is June 2021, we can't just start talking to each other again in May, right? What's our plan for tracking progress? How will we know we're on the right track? In digital, right, we talk a lot about our metrics and analytics, but the truth is there's metrics everywhere. We analyze everything. What are our goal markers? What are our mile markers on this road to know that this is going well? And if it's not, like, how do we adjust? How do we amend, right? How do we decide that ahead of time? I do a whole bunch of if we start fighting, what is the process that we want to engage? Do we want to just sit down and hash it out? Do we want a third person? Because it is inevitable at some point, we are not going to agree about how this project is going. How often should we meet? I hate meeting. Some people like meeting a lot. How often should we meet? And then what's the financial agreement? To be honest, what's really going on? What are the contractual details? And I am someone, if you have not, you're a luckier person than I am, but I'm someone who's been burned by a handshake agreement. What do we have in writing? And how do we use that to come back? Do folks have any other questions that they consider before doing collaboration together? And if so, I'd love to see them in the chat.
I'll just unmute for a moment and say, in artistic process, who makes decisions about the art itself? Is there an agreement that the artist has complete agency over the art, or is the agreement that there's a collaborative process around the aesthetics themselves?
Yeah, these are some good ones. How much do you pay other people for similar work? What is your budget? Are you trying to pay me far less than you would pay another organization or artist? What happens after the project is done? And I like this one also, to be fluid. The things that we agreed on in the beginning, it just might not be the way it works out. People have different capacity, different interests, different moments happen. Yes, opportunities for revision, which for me is how do we adjust, amend? How do we not be rigid about this process, right? Absolutely. Who owns the work? And honestly, and I see this, thank you, Armando, when is it time to just, you know what, this isn't it? And we can do that respectfully and know when to get up from the table. Thanks. Can I get the next slide? That one, thank you. So for me, I live in South Minneapolis, actually a few blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. And the reason that I am bringing that up in this training is because it's a quick story about a punctuated moment and a lack of collaboration, right? So George Floyd was murdered at like a little convenience store on the corner across the street from my therapist. It's just true. You don't need that detail. And and so many things happened in the days after that, one including people who felt really mournful and going to the site of the murder. There's also a strategic choice to stay in front of the building to disallow folks from entering the store to patronize it. People wanted to starve out the business because they felt the business had been complicit, had been a part of the murder, right? And it just, everything was happening so fast. And this is a moment where artists from the community were also feeling the urgency of the moment. And this is a mural that went up, right? And this is a mural that ended up being really one of the famous national photos from the protests and from the uprising. And it also was one that has continued to this day to have a lot of backlash around it, because artists went there really urgently and did not in any way talk to the organizers who were organizing the space, who were organizing the protest in front of the building, and who were organizing the memorial. And they ended up doing things like making a sacred space out of a building that people thought had been a part of George Floyd's murder, right? And figured, like, is this strategic? Now people aren't, like, of all of these businesses going up in flames around us, this one's gonna not be touched now. And is that something that we wanted to protect? Also, this was done by a white artist collective. And, like, who gets to claim this as community? Because this was seen as a big moment of national and local Black mourning. And this image that has now been broadcast all over the news everywhere was actually created by white artists who started to then fundraise off of the mural, right? And so then when there was backlash against that, they started redirecting funds in their fundraiser to Black organizations, which they had not contacted in advance. And so some of them contacted them back and said, I'm not interested in being a part of your too late apology to this community. And this is an artist. I know a lot of the artists have lived in the community for generations. Their families are generations deep. And they went there with a sense of urgency and rapid response that was not strategic. And it's something that could have been avoided if there had been some collaboration with the organizers in the space who were literally like 50 feet away. And so, it's sort of, again, like not every response is strategic, and not every expression actually represents a community when there's a lack of collaboration. And there was a clear lack of collaboration on this project. And really just sort of tense feelings about what this art means now. And I'll stop there.
Great. So this is, we're going to have a chance for some Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat and Oscar will lift them up. But also, if you would like to speak, we have a little bit of time, maybe 20 minutes to have some conversation. And I want to say that, first of all, thank you to Iram and Irna for all of that amazing information and questions asked and good thinking. Please feel free to put appreciations for them in the chat as well as questions. But one of the things that Irna particularly wanted for this session was to have a conversation. So we really do invite you to share some questions in the chat, or if you would like to turn on your video so that we can see you and let us know that you want to speak. We would love to invite you to be part of the dialogue at this time. Oh, Armando, yes, you have a question. Go ahead.
Just want to comment, because I made that comment. I'd never seen the mural before for some reason. I hadn't been aware of that mural. And then you telling the story, like the first thing that caught my mind, besides just how vibrant it was that line. And it wasn't until Andrea pointed out that it was done, and then you earned by a white artist, and then what trickled down after that. What that immediately brought to me, working in communities that I work, I've been with in moments when people from the outside are coming into a community wanting to be that lone ranger, coming in to do save the day type of stuff, but without any true information as to how you can best support the community and how you can best help what it is you think you're trying to help. And so, I mean, I think that's key. Like, be informed about what you're trying to do or who you're trying to help on every possible level before you actually do something so rapid as we were talking about.
Iram or Irna, do you have responses to Armando?
I actually was looking in some of the notes that I made on this slide, and I mean, one of our big values as a Kairos network is that we're not lone wolves, right? Like, we are, even when we're in different organizations, Iram and I have collaborated on a number of things. We don't work at the same organization and never have, because we are building a network of people, to build power in the digital realm. And if any of us, I mean, our organizing value is that if any of us comes at this work as a lone wolf, then that doesn't build power.
Great, thank you. I see some more conversation about the mural in the chat. Does anyone else have a question that you'd like to ask, or just a response to and be part of the dialogue? Don't be shy, y'all. These are some great folks to talk to. Oh, I did wanna, there is one thing that we talked about in the planning process that Iram had brought up actually, or maybe Irna brought it up about something great about Iram's work, which is I think what actually happened around this idea of messaging and how you create the message and own the message. And I'm wondering if Iram, you could speak about that a little bit, or Irna, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So I think this came up in the planning. And one thing to note is this is also related to rapid response and how it can happen in really bad ways. So after the first Muslim ban was implemented, there were really well-intentioned allies who were saying things. And some of the things they were saying is, like, we shouldn't be banning people from these countries because these countries are the ones that are bad. And it was like, no, we shouldn't be banning people from any country, actually, right? And so I really, I had to write an entire guide about how to speak about the Muslim ban, especially for allies, because it was not happening in the way, in the frameworks that we needed to happen, because they were using a lot of the opposition's frameworks themselves, right? And how do we actually not do that? And that's happening right now as well, right? When there's an extremist Supreme Court nominee using terms like, oh, well, this is the same as like Sharia law, and how we wouldn't want someone who supports Sharia law. Well, that's a right-wing terminology, right? Like the way the right wing weaponizes religion and religious identity against Muslim communities, and it's being used by everyone, right? And so how do we not play into the frameworks of our of people who don't share our values and create the messaging that we need to create? And that goes for like art as well as like campaigning. So there's like another example where in early 2017, Shepard Fairey came up with the 3 huge posters that became really, really famous and popular. One of them was of a Muslim woman donned in hijab, and that hijab was the American flag, right? And so that image, I still hate it so much, and it's still everywhere, right? And it comes up all the time, but it's like you're taking a very spiritual symbol and then over that you're putting like patriotism, right? And it's like, that rubs me the wrong way. And you know, the background context to that is like the image itself, the portrait that's the poster is like made off of was taken by like a Muslim person, and there are differences within our communities and our you know, how we view messaging that could be detrimental. So always have like a long-term vision whenever you're thinking of art or campaigning narrative that you're working with, and be sure to not use like oppositional messaging.
Thank you. That's such a helpful example. Also because, you know, art is inherently like deeply subjective, and there's always going to be people, even within the community, that you want to work with and speak to, even if you are, even when you are collaborating, there's still going to be people who may not like your art, right? But what's more, so what I find is a way to keep folks engaged and keep people working together and actually build community is, even if someone doesn't like the aesthetics, or they don't like the identity of the artist, or they don't like a specific thing, if that vision is big enough and is moving toward a future that the community believes in and wants to see together, folks will work with each other. Folks will work through those difficult spots in collaboration if the larger vision is clear and is really owned by the community as well as the artist. We want to encourage you to ask some more questions or even just comments or participate in the dialogue, and I'm going to pass it back to Irna to see if you have any comments or thoughts on that part.
I was thinking about you know, whenever there's a young Black person who's extrajudicially murdered, right? There's you know, often an attempt to frame this person as responsible for their own death, like they were no angel, they were this, and I mean, and there's so what you said, Iram, reminded me of all of the times that that in order to combat that message, we actually accidentally reify it with like whole classes of Black doctors in their lab coats being like, would you shoot me? And, you know, the point is nobody should be murdered in the street. Like, no one, it doesn't matter. And there's ways that if we are responding to other people's narratives, then we give those narratives more airtime than when we just have our own vision and our own narrative that we're advancing. And there's some, yeah, I'll say that.
Thank you, Irna. KD has a question. Go ahead, KD.
So first off, I just want to say thank you both for providing insight. The presentation was very good. And thank you, Irna, for providing the backstory to that mural. Definitely changes like my view from when I first saw it to actually hearing the story on like how I see it now. I do want to ask, so specifically for the engagement piece of the presentation, I know like my organization have over like 5,000 followers, but what we lack is engagement. Like, so sometimes we'll host like Zoom calls, or I mean, not Zoom calls, like IG lives. And so like we have like 5,000 followers, but only like 20 people on live. Or certain posts, like if it's about like a protest that we're doing, we'll see about 500 likes. But if it's about like, let's say we're hosting a Black Women Relief Fund, or something that like a homeless clothing drive, it'll only have like, you know, like 100 to like it's like less. So it's like realistically trying to get, I guess my question right now is if you would provide insight, if you can, how do we get people engaged with the community side of the work, not just like, you know, like taken to the streets and angry? Because I mean, like, yes, we want to take it to the streets, but there's also work that needs to be done in the community that also like elevates that as well.
Yeah, so this is the problem with algorithms and how they're actually built, right? And sometimes that's out of our hands. So Facebook, Twitter, even sometimes Instagram, what they'll do is like they promote content that's much more emotional, which protests, like especially Facebook lives of protests, end up doing so much better than other lives, right? Like just a panel or what have you. So that's already built into the algorithm. But what I will say is it might be that that community building doesn't happen on those platforms. So where are you moving people off of those platforms and having those conversations? Maybe it's one-on-ones, maybe it's engaging people in a Zoom room, right? So where do you want like to move people from the public platform, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to more like community and relational areas that where you can continue building the relationship to individuals, right? That's one thing that I will say. The other thing is like there's research out there that usually shows like, oh, these types of posts tend to perform better than these, right? So photographs tend to have more likes, I believe, or comments versus likes. And then videos have more likes versus comments or things like that, right? So also experimenting with the type of content that you're putting out and see which content actually attracts more engagement from your people, from your followers and from your members, and whether the followers are actually like the people you're trying to organize, right? There might be a disconnect there too, and see if there's a way you can bridge that gap. If the followers are not the people you're trying to organize, then that might mean you need to like reorient and rebuild like, you know, a follower list, or like to figure out ways to attract those members a little bit more.
It's funny. I was thinking so many people hate follow my organization. They just really and truly hate follow. This is more offline organizing, but I'm always curious about how this works online. So I would love to know if you had any insight about this, Iram. But you know, even when Andrea was talking about how we know each other, a friend of mine who I really respect as an artist is who introduced me to Andrea's work, and I was really excited about it. And so I got my community excited about it. Like she was fundraising for this project, and it was, I don't know, like $1,000 away from the goal. And I was like, well, I would hate for this to not happen for this small amount of money. You all, we can do it. And a bunch of people who'd never heard of Art2Action or Andrea Assaf were engaging with this because of our relationship. And so I wonder, and that was digital, that was through social media. I wonder about those folks who are engaging with some of your other content, Katie, about how to build them as leaders and validators and people who will spread, really like to vouch for your work in their networks.
Thank you.
We have just a few more minutes. We definitely have some announcements and next steps to share with you, but I wonder if there's one more question out there that somebody is chewing on that they'd like to share, or any maybe closing thoughts from Iram and Irna if there aren't any more questions. Or comments if anyone has a final question or response.
Oh yeah, one question. As far as like the narrative of art in collaboration with organizing, and having like an intentional goal, how do you like promote the leadership without providing the narrative or the art that speaks on kind of the ugly truth that, like, for example, the George Floyd one had flowers and sunshine and all these things that are like bright and happy that attract people, but again are very like mischievous and fake, and you know what I'm saying? So it's like, where's the narrative of kind of the ugly truth? Do you think that that's important for digital engagement to kind of show the ugliness, or is there kind of like a lot of blockage with kind of showing that in an artistic way? As somebody who paints and does art and, you know, would be potentially working with people who have to state the ugly facts. So
this is a really interesting question. I think it's something that artists struggle with a lot, actually, in terms of, you know, what is it that, for me, and because I do want to hear from Irna and Iram on this, but for me, it's like, what do I need to express? What am I trying to say? And is that messaging aligned with my partners in you know, the strategic work they're trying to do? But also, like, what kind of space is it trying to create? Like, sometimes we do have to, sometimes when we want to talk about painful or violent things as artists, we have to ask ourselves all kinds of aesthetic questions about how do we make something that is speaking the truth and also not furthering the trauma to the communities that have already been assaulted, right? How do we balance those aesthetic choices with the difficult content in a way that makes it possible for people to be with the work? So that's what I think about as an artist, but I'd really love to hear from Iram and Irna how you think about it from an organizing perspective, or both.
I mean, I think for me, there's still the bigger question of intention. Like, what is it that you're trying to evoke and why, right? Because there's unmasking ugly truths, and that is a really important thing. I appreciate what Andrea said about re-traumatizing communities as well, because that's something to think about. But, you know, one thing, like for instance, in Minneapolis, one thing that's happened since George Floyd was murdered was just so many murals, because businesses were boarding up their windows to protect the property. And so people then started painting all of those. And I found that there are really hopeful things like this, the George Floyd mural, which were inspiring for people. And then there are some just flat out expressions of anger. And what was interesting to me was the expressions of anger and where they were geographically in the city, right? And they were in commerce corridors is where those expressions of anger and ugliness happen. And it was really, I remember one day just driving with my partner and seeing just graffiti that I found hilarious, to be perfectly honest. And can I swear on here? Is that a
Oscar? Is that okay?
As long as it's not partisan.
It's a nonpartisan swear, but someone had rearranged the letters on the marquee sign for White Castle. And so it had some of the White Castle slogan on it. It was just like, where it would normally say satisfy your craving, it said like atisai your fuck 12, you know, and then the rest of the letters. And I thought that was amazing, because at the same time that we were in this deep pain, we're also seeing these people in like their Lululemon yoga pants, and in the idea that they were really needing to be viciously confronted with what was happening as they were trying to ignore it. I actually thought was really important, but it mattered where it was, right? If that makes sense.
Thank you for that example. Appreciate it.
Any final words, Iram, before we close out?
No, not really. I mean, I'm just going to emphasize what we started off with, that digital is a realm, right? Like, you're interacting with real people, you're trying to organize real people, and to always consider that it's not just a tool that you're using to you know, count off that, like, yes, we did this, we had a post on Facebook and a post on Instagram and a post on Twitter, but really, like, you're participating in a realm, and you're trying to like galvanize your people for power, right? That's actually what's happening there. So be mindful of how that's happening, and make sure that you know who your people are, you know where you're trying to move them, you know which platforms are going to get you there. That's it.
Thank you so much. Please give, oh, go ahead, Irna.
I was going to say, when I talk about digital as a realm, I also talk about digital as a geography, right? This is a place. Digital has neighborhoods, it has communities, it has, it has spaces where things are okay and not okay. And there's different rules here and there's different rules there. And like my organization, we don't engage much on Twitter because it doesn't serve our goals, but we engage a lot on YouTube and Facebook because it does what we're supposed to do. But I definitely know that I code switch between Facebook, where my auntie is, and Twitter, where I don't know anybody for real, and so digital is a realm and an arena of power building, but it's also a geography that has different neighborhoods and, the idea that you have to act accordingly in different spaces.
That's great. There's so much wisdom and knowledge in this conversation. We have recorded it and we hope to make it available in some form so that you can share it with more people and come back to it. I also want to give a shout out to the H-Town Votes artists that are on the call and are doing all this work in digital space, particularly because of the pandemic. And we hope that you will follow H-Town Votes on social media and engage with it to help us amplify and build community around the amazing work the artists are doing, and check out their projects on both Houston and Action's website and Art2Action. I'm going to turn it back. I'm going to say thank you to everyone for being here today and turn it back to Oscar for some closing announcements.
Yes, thank you all for joining us today. Remember, if you need to contact either me or Andrea, our emails are here. We'll be more than happy to follow up with you. If you want to see our next trainings that are coming up, I know that, quick plug, today's the last day for census. I think tomorrow at 9 a.m. is when they're closing everything off, if I'm not mistaken. So if you haven't filled it out or know someone hasn't filled it out, right now is the time to do it. We're still doing a lot of work around voter engagement as moving into the elections. Oh, this is tonight, so you better do it today to make sure that people fill it out. But if you want to see other trainings that we're doing, we are committed to racial justice and leading trainings around cultural organizing, as well as racial justice and arts, and as well as all the voter mobilization efforts that we're currently pushing up into the elections. You can go to HoustonAction.org/calendar for more information on the trainings, where you can register and participate and help us lead. By all means, follow us at Houston in Action. I know that Irma said follow my organization ain't the best call, but I'm gonna add it here just so you can also connect with us in Art2Action too. But also use that hashtag HTownVotes, where you can see the spectrum of everything that we're currently moving on. So I wanna thank everyone for joining us, but before you leave, I do ask that you can please go to this quick bit.ly. It is case sensitive, it's all lowercase, bit.ly/artdigi15. That's bit, which I'll write it in the chat. bit.ly/artdigi10. Here we will be hearing from you. Sorry, it's 15. What a mistake. Here's what we want to hear from you and your thoughts about this training today. If you want to give input, suggestions on how to improve, or what other trainings you would like to do. This is hopefully one step of the digital organizing training that we have. We are considering a lot of other things that are way more details for big organization, doing analyzing the work and how we measure it as well. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next training.